All right, thanks everyone for joining us. This is Leah Brown with the Greater Des Moines Partnership. We want to welcome you to this web session today. We are visiting with us for maintaining profitability during COVID-19 with Dr. Matthew Mitchell and Wade Britt of Baton Global. We'll be addressing balancing our short-term liquidity and profitability challenges with long-term strategic planning. So thank you for joining us, and welcome to Dr. Matthew Mitchell and Wade Britt.
Leah, thank you very much. Wade?
Indeed, thank you.
So looking forward to the conversation today. I see a lot of familiar faces in the room. So, I do hope this is as interactive as you would like it to be. So with Ryan and Kirk in the room, just know that we may come and call on you from the GDMP. But thanks for everyone for joining us. Really do appreciate it. We represent Baton Global in this conversation, and Baton in many ways is here to serve Des Moines and the wider world. And so I'll introduce myself very briefly before we get to the meat of our conversation. But my name is Matthew, and I wear two hats. One as a professor at Drake University, and one as a partner at Baton Global. Our goal in thinking about Baton early on was, how do we bring the world's best talent to serve and protect this community that we go to sleep in, that we wake up in every single day. One of my favorite things to do in calls like these is bring out my flag of Des Moines hat every once in a while and wave that flag proudly. Basically, the baton is the image of the shepherd, hopefully a protector of sorts, but this community aspect is really, really important to us, and the GDMP is probably the first among our organizations in this community that protects and serves this. So when we think about maintaining profitability, GDMP has done a fantastic job at leading the charge, protecting local businesses, while simultaneously, preparing us for the future. With that, I'll just say I love strategy. I am somewhat of a technophile. I am a recovering physicist and programmer. And so those are the lenses through which I think about the world. But with that, I'll turn it over to Mr. Wade Britt, who is executive strategy, project management par excellence. Mr. Britt.
Thank you very much, Matthew. Just by way of introduction, again, my name's Wade Britt. I support the operations and client engagements at Baton Global. In terms of some of my background, I've spent about 15 years in the logistics industry in South Asia and Europe, and a number of years, probably about 8 years, in education technology in the United States, South America, and the Caribbean. This is also not my first pandemic. I was responsible for a number of functions for a logistics company out in South Asia back in 2003 when SARS hit. So there's a little bit of a deja vu to some of these things. But that's a bit all about myself. Thanks for showing up today, and look forward to having a good conversation with you.
It's nice to be able to rely on previous experience, and as much as we say this is unprecedented, I think there is somewhat of a precedent, and Wade's had that experience. We started off the morning with a meeting that said whenever anyone says the term new normal, or everything has changed, or pandemic, then we all choose to drink a little bit, and I have two mugs here. I think that could be a fun exercise, but it is a cliche, but it is so true. Before we get into the material, I'll just say, Baton, we focus on strategy, innovation, leadership, and research. In the strategy domain, we're sort of a soup to nuts advisory shop. focusing on strategic planning, but also developing a culture of continuous improvement, both here and abroad. Marrying that strategic, long-term focus with operational execution in the short term. That goes hand in hand with leadership development, engaging boards in these conversations through to executive coaching and succession planning. Wade? And Wade, you're on mute. There you go.
Speaking a bit about innovation is really just looking that we're maximizing our clients' use of processes and data. And then, of course, for research, we do quite a large range of bespoke research to help people really get at big questions that they're struggling with.
Yeah. So with that, we're going to jump right into it. It is 12:36. We have a full hour. I will also say that as we go through the conversation today, I'm sure there will be different folks that have different ways of wanting to interact. And so Leah, I see, has posted on our chat function. And I would invite anyone else that has questions, feel free to engage with us in that way. I think it's a good model for how we lead in a digital and virtually connected way, that we have to not only welcome folks into a conversation, but also recognize that some are more reflective thinkers. They want to engage with different engagement styles. So using that chat as we manage our teams, I think is a nice invitation. So feel free to throw some questions in there as you would like. We will respond to those. But Leah, thanks for helping moderate that channel as well. So Mr. Britt, we have a few questions here to kick us off. The first one that folks submitted, I think via a quick poll in advance of this: how do we balance what we have been with what we will become in this new normal? Basically, what got us here will not necessarily get us there. And these are cliches, but I think COVID has shot an arrow through the hearts of all of our previous plans and strategies. And how do we pivot to think about, being good stewards of the organization that will emerge from this crisis, not necessarily the organization that may have existed before this crisis. So Wade, I just turn it to you as we start with this and focusing on the near term with profitability, liquidity, and just emergency response. How do we reconcile or balance what we've been previously with what we will become?
Still struggling with that mute button from time to time. Oftentimes in supporting people through a journey of defining a strategic plan, we often talk about the idea that strategy really involves saying no to a lot of things, and that ability to focus in on a few core things to do is very much at the heart of crisis adaptation as well. So in terms of balancing, what we have been with what we might become in the new normal, being good stewards of the organization, a lot of this comes down to focus and to really trying to understand that maybe there were 20 things that were perceived as being important 6 months ago, but it's very likely that number is going to reduce down a bit to allow the organization to really focus on those few things that need to be executed upon commensurately for the period of this pandemic.
The focusing on the vital few, and this morning even I called up an image of, and I'm just gonna grab it if I can, of the rocks and sand, and basically the metaphor is if we let if you put a mason jar and you have sand and rocks, if we put the sand in first, then all the rocks don't fit. But if we put those big aspects in there first, the directionally correct, then you put those in the mason jar and then pour the sand around them, and even the emails tend to fit. But if you don't focus on those vital few things that are critical, it's not going to work out in the long term. The next thing I think I just want to focus on is culture, and recognizing that you and your organization have built a culture over sometimes a few years, sometimes over decades, and for many organizations in our community, over more than 100 years. And those elements of culture will be very, strong pillars of strength as you work through this crisis. And yet there comes a time where you have to question, are some elements of our culture allowing us to respond quickly? Or are some elements of our culture not designed or well suited to allow us to respond quickly in very rapid succession? And one executive that I chatted with over the past few months said our culture of actuarial precision is not something that we have the luxury of retaining during this crisis time. There are a few things we know with great amount of certainty, and yet there are many, many other things that we cannot know. And so, Wade, as you think about your previous experiences, how did you reconcile that, we want to know everything. We are conscientious, hardworking, and in many of our cases, professionals that desire certainty. How do you let go of some of that certainty and as we manage through the crisis period?
Sure. It's not so much of, wanting to let go of it as situations really forcing your hand, in that there is an absence of actionable data to react to. I know that a little further down, we talk about temporary changes in governance. So I think it'll be good to kind of sweep back up on that point then. But certainly the idea that decision-making needs to be redefined because it's not a normal situation, and the sort of crisis team approach of pushing decisions through perhaps a smaller and less consensual group than happens in normal times can be a very effective way of ensuring that the organization can make decisions quickly to be able to navigate through this time.
Yeah, absolutely. Here's the image of the sand and rocks. If anybody needed if anybody thinks visually, this is always a very good reminder to focus on those vital few. And honestly, during a crisis period, I think the vital few becomes even more narrow. Communication comes to mind, prioritization comes to mind, and profitability is chief among those, because profitability today means sustainability over the long term. And I'll repeat that again. Profitability today, in many ways, means and supports sustainability over the long term. Okay, so the last one is as we warm up the crowd, and I see a few other folks joining us, which is fantastic. Feel free to put some comments or questions in the chat function along that chat bar. So definitely want to welcome to the conversation Bunker Labs and United Services. So thanks for that. We've got Robin and Kelly and quite a few more here. So feel free to join this conversation. We're just getting started. The last one, Wade, is really a question about, do I make bold decisions in the short term or project stability and wait for clarity? Knowing that there are many risks associated with making bold decisions, that we can't know the future for certain. And yet, do I need to go big or go home, as they say, or do I need to project stability in the short term, and anticipate that clarity will come, through a series of dates, through a series of actions taken by our local, national, and global governance. So what do you think? Wade, do you think it's the time for bold decisions, or continue to wait for that clarity?
It's certainly a time for some bold decisions, but the way that you can perhaps limit the risk of bold decisions is by sort of going through your current priorities. There are often things that haven't been actioned or haven't moved quickly enough that the organization would like to see some change in. And this is often a really, really good time to use this as a forcing mechanism to be able to take steps that are going to enhance the long-term survivability of the firm.
Yeah. So I think we'll pause here, and I'm going to stop sharing, and maybe you can go to gallery view, and you can see everybody that's joined the conversation. But I definitely would welcome at this point any comments, questions. We've got a few other materials teed up already, but Leah, as I look out at folks here, I know we can have the ability to unmute, but please feel free to invite folks. Is there anybody that would like to ask a question, or before we dive into some other things? And I'm going to provide some vamping on air. Leah, what would be the best way if they did have the ability to ask questions? What's the best way to identify those other than the chat function?
Sure, thank you. So if you are looking on the chat box, there's actually options where you can essentially raise your hand or thumbs up, that type of thing. It looks like maybe we have one or two folks on the phone. I can unmute if somebody is looking for an opportunity to speak directly with our presenters today. Just, feel whatever you feel comfortable with. You can message the host separately, or you can message the group using the function for chat. So
they do have a raise hand button. Is that what I'm understanding, Leah?
Yeah, there's there are a few options here. So if you go down to reactions, you can clap. You can also provide a thumbs up.
Fantastic.
And if you agree or have thoughts on any stated messaging coming out, you can also yes or no or things like that. So
perfect.
Feel free. We want this to be as interactive as possible. So if you have something to share, please do.
Absolutely, and at the same time, if Bunker Labs is given a thumbs up, so Bernie, definitely, if you have any questions, let us know. And I just unmuted Bernie. Did you want? Whoops. Bernie, did you want to get in and ask a question?
No, I just wanted to, I'm interested to hear where the conversation goes. We're always interested in strategy at Bunker Labs, and especially in this new time where old paradigms maybe need to be not paid attention to as much. So times for growth and strategy and new thinking. And so, yeah, let me know if you need me to dive in on something, or you need, if you want some audience participation.
Fantastic. And Bernie, just since you're on the line, would love sort of what are you doing to in the short term to manage liquidity, profitability? Maybe we'll start there, and then we can carry on into some other content. Bernie?
Yeah, well, I guess I would have to answer that question in two parts. One, with what I'm doing here and representing is Bunker Labs. We help veterans and military spouses start businesses. So in terms of that and the strategy, very interesting time as people are finding themselves furloughed or laid off and having time to think. We are advising clients not to jump into the deep end. If there truly aren't other options for cash generation, revenue for themselves to take care of their families and the basic necessities, then fine if you're at that point. But if there are other ways, now is not the best time to start a business unless you're in some type of a medical service provider. For me personally, I have a private equity company, and that strategy is cash, cash, cash. I'm not doing investments. There are some very lucrative deals being bandied about, but my business is basically the mitigation of risk. And unless somebody can tell me that there's a vaccine or something that is, that takes away the unknowns of the 3 to 6 month timeline,
Yeah.
I will go ahead and wait and hold pat.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you for that. I think there will be opportunity. And Bernie, I like what you said, sort of, weighing very carefully, is now the time to start a business, especially for your constituents, for your clients. This is a challenging time to start a business. And yet, if you are aligned to the right vertical, this could be a fantastic time. And I've got a few stories, but Bernie, take it away, and then we'll.
Yeah, and I just want to clarify, it's not necessarily don't start something or don't think about it or it's not an option. Right now is not the time to sign a 7-year lease on a space that costs you $150,000 a year. Right now is not the time to pay for a patent that costs $50,000 or sign some contract that's in that piece of starting a business. Doing the thought, doing the work, developing your business plan, seeking mentorship, doing Des Moines partnership events, absolutely you should do that. But betting the farm, so to speak, on this dynamic in this day and age where there's so much uncertainty, we would not advise. So do your homework, but take deliberate, well thought out steps.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I just ask Wade to jump in here. Thoughts about that, especially as we think about, individuals starting new businesses, and then maybe even those smaller businesses thinking about expanding lines of service, products. Wade?
Certainly. There's a lot of opportunity to perhaps revisit some of the services that you currently provide. I guess something that comes to mind is speaking to a large staffing agency that's based out in the Middle East. And what they had discovered from looking across their different verticals, they saw that some verticals were really getting clobbered, right? Like restaurants that were in malls no longer needed any staff. Construction, however, was booming. Delivery really started to boom as well. And they'd really done some thinking internally to say as well, how can we best matchmake some of the assets that we have across verticals? And what they actually discovered is that not only were they able to rebalance a large number of the people they're placing across different verticals, but they were able to do so at a more effective cost per unit than they had done previously. So this is something that's really kind of changing their mind about how they even want to approach business going forward more generally, just based on how this very intense period of time has caused them to be a little more creative about a product that they frankly have been offering for years.
Yeah. Let's just think about, if I defined my business from a perspective of relationships, customer relationships, and I differentiated myself through, prioritizing investments in-person relationships, serving through, distribution channels that have high touch. Well, COVID-19, as Meg Schneider sort of pointed out in the chat function here, has driven a stake through that heart, and in 5 weeks we've needed to figure out how to pivot on that relationship orientation to deliver services in a radically different way. And Wade, I'm just going to bring up one of the best organizations that I've seen pivot even quicker than I anticipated was a local business that teaches fitness classes and Taekwondo, and that's Farrell's. And they sent all of their staff home much more quickly than some of their larger businesses, to protect their home first, protect their staff first, and then instantaneously they had simultaneous in-person classes when that was still available, and online classes and didn't even miss a beat. When I think about agile mindset, when I think about sending an entire staff home and then leveraging some of those things very, very quickly, it just comes up as a best practice. Now, if you have a staff of 3,000, 10,000, enterprise wide, that's a little bit more difficult. And so, I think some of our clients ordered 5,000 laptops, 2,500 laptops to get their home office employees, into their homes and equipped. That is real thinking forward, because now their clients are expecting not to come into physical locations, but to be served digitally. And so that move looks very prescient. That do you buy licenses? Do you buy the equipment? Number one among those is an office chair. Do you let your folks come in and take their office chairs home? Because that's critically important. Wade, anything else? I think we've got a few other things on the chat.
I'll take a look down on the chat. Let's see, everything has changed.
Just from Meg in particular, this idea that everything has changed, and Meg, I don't know if you were with us, but whenever anybody says everything has changed, it is time to take a drink. The past 4 weeks have ripped the bandage off of some of those tactics we knew we needed to think about but hadn't acted on. How do we, perhaps thinking of a small business in particular, act and position for the future? So Wade, maybe this is a good time to come back to the slide here. And as we think about small businesses, what does get the house in order? What is, minimize the risk of eroding margins? And whether it's data-driven or data-informed, how do small businesses conduct scenario planning, Wade?
Sure. Well, what we're trying to group along here, 3 different areas of topics that we can talk about. And a lot of these are going to be applicable regardless of the size of the business. They should work for small and large alike, although some might be suited to more than one or the other. Do you just want to run through the different sub-slides on these subject areas, Mitchell? Absolutely. Is the way to get started with getting the house in order, and I'll go to item number 1.
Fantastic.
When we talk about this idea of, well, what does that really mean? It's like there's oftentimes when business is operating as normal or when times are really good, there is a tendency for people to want to load up their shopping cart quite a bit, to take a lot of things on, because there are a lot of things that are capturing one's attention in a lot of areas where you might want to improve. Getting the house in order really means to go back and revisit the things that are on and to really evaluate them in the light of the new demands, which one now is quite critically cash flow and employee care, to really make sure that's what is being focused on are those things. And it is absolutely okay to let a number of other things slide in a time like this for when you have more bandwidth. So the first point I'll speak to a little bit in terms of activate the crisis team. Business as usual model, decision making can often be very widely consensual. It can often take a long period of time to arrive at a decision. And during crisis situations, it's usually very, very important to empower a more narrow group of people with more specific specialization relative to the questions at hand, to be making decisions quickly, communicating them out very effectively, but the idea that you really want to enable a fast lane for decision making, so that you're not perhaps tied up in the business as usual process.
Hey, Wade, just on that point in particular, I found a very good piece of advice. Basically, it spoke to empowering those selected few who have the right character and judgment in crisis periods. So you don't have to worry about the decisions from an integrity perspective that they are making. You identify those, skill sets and competencies for sure, but the folks that have the right character and judgment really shine during these crucible moments of crisis. Wade?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. You need to think about different qualities that you might recognize in a person to be a part of this crisis team. If I think about a real tangible example in the logistics industry, which of course this is kind of around the clock type operation. But a crisis team was set up that was manned 24/7. It didn't mean necessarily that it was the senior most people on the crisis team. You had a lot of mid-level managers, but they had expertise in these areas that were being most impacted. And the point of that crisis team was that the decision making as usual, where something might go up through a few different chains, was kind of leapfrog to where you could go to that operational command center and get information on which flights you could reroute material to, or which subcontractors were going to be available, and what sort of temporary arrangements you could put into place. So again, just returning a bit of agility to the business at a time when you might need to move a lot faster than you're used to.
Wade, and we'll go to the next slide here very short, but Meg, I liked the way you put in your quote and in your question, as we think about where we are now and where we need to be heading, everything has changed. The past 4 weeks ripped off the bandage off of those tactics we perhaps knew we needed to think about, but hadn't acted on. The last 10 years have been a lovely run. And in many ways, we have had the luxury of not thinking about speed, agility, and managing, as you said, to avoid eroding margins, because the margins in general for the last 10 years have been very good. And yet I think now in somewhat of a time of scarcity is when we really need to question everything that we had been doing in the run-up and what we will do going forward. Wade, maybe next is a great place to tackle, this risk of eroding margins.
Sure. A lot of, I think, a congruent message across really making sure that your strategy is as tightly focused as it can be, and something that you can do in the face of eroding margins. I always go back to, what happened to the American auto industry during the Great Recession, right? It's another maybe unusual or atypical strong event that challenges people's profitability. And lo and behold, what you usually find is that you had the makings of a solution to this problem a little earlier. It was something that was already on the agenda, but perhaps in a non-crisis situation, it wasn't brought to the forefront as much because perhaps there wasn't as much emphasis on margin protection. And the big change to a lot of these automotive manufacturers through that process was the rationalization of their product set and brand, which positioned them to be much more strong from an operational capability, from a quality capability, and of course that translates really well to a margin capability. So again, it's a good opportunity to take these sort of exogenous events that are very dramatic, but to really think about what are they showing you about your core business, and how can you better improve quality, optimize service delivery to really protect that margin, because it can be a gift to have this ability to reassess your product, reassess your delivery mechanism. I mean, Matthew, your example of Farrell's was really good. Digital channel was maybe something that someone there had thought about amusedly twice. But then when faced with a real situation where it becomes critical to delivering service, they're able to pivot and implement quite quick to protect their customer.
Wade, I'll just say we advise one insurance company that thought about this 5 years ago. And so they had laid the infrastructure to be able to serve their clients in a different way. And maybe even 5 years ago, folks were laughing at them, saying, you can never do this online. Our buyers are much older, and they just will not purchase these highly involved products digitally. Well, they have had their largest month in January. That has doubled every month since then. And so, what it does is it says, all those reasons for why we haven't done this in the past, given the right external factors, really, lays that strategy and that, thinking to waste, because given the right conditions like COVID-19, these strategies, consumer experience, consumer engagement, digital integration, have just accelerated their business. So with that, Wade, do you want to move on to the last pillar here before we move forward into some questions? And I've got some good questions on the chat here.
Yeah, I actually do. Maybe just want to talk a bit about Ryan's question first, and then we'll bounce back to the
go for it.
Previously sketched out menu. Thanks, Ryan, for your question about, what impact are you seeing on globalization, and how is the pandemic impacting global supply chain, and do you expect long-term changes? There's always a bit of a risk about breaking out the old crystal ball and trying to future gaze about the state of a whole industry, but I did spend a significant period of my life in global logistics, so it's just an area that I'm rather geekily excited about. The biggest change I see, and keep in mind the backdrop of all of this is not negative, right? Like a former colleague of mine runs PostNord, which is one of the largest e-fulfillment logistics services in Scandinavia. He says they just had their best quarter, right? You don't have to imagine too much to realize that people are getting very adept and happy with e-fulfillment as they're all self-isolating. Now, some things that could change is that there had been, as a lot of businesses were really paying attention to getting economies of scale, you saw maybe that supplier networks were winnowed down, right? And there's been a lot of talk about, China's dominant and key place in a lot of global supply chains. It might not be that those things necessarily get reshored, but you may see actually a deepening and a widening of globalization as people recognize that many of the same positive benefits you can get from sourcing material in China, you can also get from Argentina, you can also get from Vietnam. So there are a lot of perhaps knock-on effects where we might see some erosion of previous habits that had gotten a little too comfortable, and a need to reposition some of those to be better able to stand up against shocks such as what we're seeing. Ryan, did that give a little bit of response to your question?
I think Ryan is also simultaneously managing a full household, and so we're pulled in a few different directions. So whether we put our microphones on, we know we're all here. I love this idea of a deepening and widening of globalization, sort of diversifying that supply chain, because this was a supply side crisis in January. When this first rolled out through China, the immediate impacts were to our supply chain and sourcing materials like steel, assembled products, and so that was our leading indicator of how it may play out globally. And I've said this on a number of occasions, but the future is already with us. It's just unevenly distributed, and what I mean by that is, all we have to do is look to New York to see our case here in 2 to 3 weeks, look to Italy to see what it is 5 weeks from now, and maybe a China or God willing a South Korea, to see what our next month and a half looks like. And the lessons that we are learning from how retail is defined in China is radically different now, than it is even here. So what we're seeing in China, they've largely opened up, and yet the willingness of folks to go out of their homes after being in quarantine, a very hard quarantine for 6 weeks, is not high. So the restaurants are open, but getting people out of their homes, out of the habits they've created over the last 6 weeks of hard quarantine is proving to be very difficult. And if we translate that 6 weeks ahead for us, that's going to continue to be a very real problem as this, what I've called sludge, works through the system as we reopen. Some folks are just, deciding to prefer the way we've interacted in this past, and yet many others are not. They want to get back to a normal as soon as possible, but who knows? Okay, Bernie, we've got you raising your hand, and I'm going to do my best to get you. Bernie, I think you are with us. You are now unmuted. Bernie?
Yeah, so I just wanted to, that's exactly right. I think this is an absolutely global phenomenon, and I liken it to a pool that someone has thrown a large rock into. And so as the waves bounce off all sides, they start to interact again and again in different ways, magnify in some cases, cancel out in others. And I would use the example of shipping containers. And so we have a large manufacturing base here in the state, thankfully. And now you have some individuals that are having trouble getting shipping containers because many of those went to China and they were not filled and sent back. And so just that simple disruption where you might have an individual or a company that produces something and simply can't ship it, and they need to find new ways to do that. And so those little ripples, thinking about different ways and supply chains and those disruptions. Is there somebody that does additive manufacturing in the state? Can they produce the part you need? Truly thinking outside the box and not thinking if that one disruption happens in our business and that's the weak point of our business model, what can we do to change that weak point into something else? I think that is the businesses that are going to survive.
Yeah. Wade, shipping containers is I think your area of expertise. I know we have Jeff Kaplan, who also managed large shipping containers as a member of the Baton team here on the line. Wade, do you want to run through this data-driven scenario planning? Because as Bernie calls out, I think this rock in the pool metaphor creates a lot of potential scenarios, but how do you identify those key scenarios that you want to plan for while simultaneously looking at the vast number of potential scenarios?
Sure, and this is something that we advise people to do as a regular process. This idea of more data-driven scenario planning, but again, perhaps it was always further down on the wish list. But this is the sort of thing where a lot of internal focus can be placed to really help improve the business and how to react coming out of this period that we know we're going to come out of based on other countries that we're seeing around the world that were impacted by this earlier. I guess when we look at these different steps, the thing that we're really trying to acknowledge is that in a lot of organizations, budgets might not be really incredibly well informed by data. Oftentimes a budget is put up as an aspiration of where people would like to be, rather than grounded in analytics about where it's likely to be. And when we talk about using data analytics to create financial predictions, what we're really talking about are identifying a couple of different models, some that perhaps are based on historical data to take into account seasonality and trend, but perhaps even regression type models that will identify a few independent variables so that you can see the relationship between what's happening with those independent variables and what's happening with your business. When I think about financial services institutions in town, obviously Fed funds, Iowa unemployment, these are variables that actually have a huge impact on different lines of business, and being able to model these out to understand to what degree is this variable impacting your business, and then how can you use changes in that variable to project different scenarios going forward so that you can be a little more ready for it. It's often when there's a big change in a variable, that's not the time you want to sit down and figure out how you're going to respond to it. It's much better to identify those few variables that really have an impact on your business line and to have scenarios kind of ready to go, almost pre-packed courses of action based on shifts that could happen to those major variables.
Yeah. Well, we're looking at we're at the quarter hour here, 1:15. I think great conversation so far. So thanks for submitting those questions. I think what we would like to do is also, feel free to submit any other final questions or lessons learned in the chat function. I know we had Suzanne, who was, involved in organizing the Christmas market, Wade. And I would hate to ask you to get out your crystal ball again, but what do you think about organizing a large outdoor event potentially in December? That really would give us a bellwether for how you think things are going to be headed by December. Wade, and then we've got a couple other questions here.
Well, regardless of when the time comes, we know that the time will come and that people will want to be out and social and active again. And there's got to be a lot of good lessons learned from places that are managing COVID very well, but haven't completely shut down. I know, for example, in Stockholm, you can still go out to restaurants. It's just they've spaced the tables apart. You can go to bars. There's just X's on where you need to order from and where to go to. So I'm sure that there's going to be a lot of learnings that can be had from other places that appear to be managing this very effectively, and that can almost provide you with your shopping list of things to consider. It's like, because whenever there will be more gatherings again, right? Where we're not staying in our homes forever, but it's just a question of what are those steps that can be done to give people confidence so that they do, when it is time for us to emerge from our homes and be social again, that we can do so in a way that takes advantage of learning from places that have been managing this pretty well.
Yeah. What we see is, I think, as we follow large retailers, as we follow local, state, and federal governments, the antibody testing is going to be critical. I think we've seen specifically in China and specifically throughout East Asia and also a little bit in Europe is, this QR code for, if you've had the virus, if you are identified as, a particularly vulnerable population, there may need to be different rules of the road for, even over the weekend, I saw a news outlet openly question whether individuals should be let into grocery stores in the near term or in the midterm. So, in a country that values our individual liberties, how do we feel about, our temperature being taken to enter a retail establishment? Are we at a point as a society where we're willing to have our temperature and allow the store to be able to take that data? Are we, as a society, willing to have a tracker or a bracelet that says, yeah, we are in that particularly vulnerable population and we need a little extra space, or I need to make special accommodations for me and home delivery. So I think one thing that we all need to wrestle with is in our own businesses, how are we going to play through and define this new normal for us? And I think there's going to be some leaders that emerge to do that. There's a question Wade submitted privately, and one of those are, how are companies spending cash when products they usually buy are not available or the price point is out of reach? You may be having some cash if you're in a fortunate position, but how are folks spending that cash, and what would you advise on that?
Yeah, I think that goes back to some of the earlier discussion we had around sourcing and determining alternative means of finding product. I know Bernie had mentioned this idea about, perhaps this is a bit of a boon for local producers of shipping containers because they're able to satisfy a need due to greater proximity. That's what springs to mind more generally. I'm not sure. Did we know what industry this was relating to?
I don't, but I would say, we are in somewhat of a liquidity trap. And what I mean by that is the interest rate is at 0%. And so access to cash is going to come at a premium. If you have opportunities that you think are well substantiated or justified by our new normal, if you have a specific product or service line. I know at Baton we are providing a virtual suite of services that is priced very competitively, and so we can do a virtual strategy boot camp for anyone's organization, just like we would normally. And so it'd be, whether it's a full day, a half a day, we'll come in, do a crisis check for how you're responding, and then provide recommendations by the end of that day, fully virtually. Usually we like to build a little trust and look at people in the eye over a cup of coffee or a meal, but that's something that it's a new line of product or service. So if you have cash to be able to develop those things that make sense in this time, fantastic. Otherwise, your financial planning over the long term, I think in some ways you need to estimate, is it important to maintain stability and keep some of that cash reserve for the medium to long term, or do you need to deploy some of that cash and make some of those big arm movements now to be able to protect your medium to long term? So Wade, we got the comment from Bernie. Stanford has a daily check-in app to get real-time transmission data. Definitely a voluntary thing for now in the United States, but is there a bridge that we need to cross that will become mandated? And that's a big individual liberties question. So thank you for submitting that. We're coming down to the bottom of the hour. Wade, any other closing comments before we sign off here and say thank you to our hosts and welcome Leah and the GDMP back into the conversation?
Maybe one of the only things that we haven't spoken specifically to is, obviously the crash course that everybody's getting in digital delivery of services is, and thinking about cash flow considerations and making your firm more successful and able to sustain itself over time is, it's a great opportunity for people to reevaluate their physical footprint needs. Because it might be that there are some capital items that are no longer needed or not needed to the extent that they were. This has been a real interesting time for people to be exposed to working remotely. Some people have always loved it and some people have always hated it and avoided it, but here it is. So taking this as a learning example for your enterprise and looking at some real data around success of communication across your firm and how that's impacting your key performance indicators can certainly be something that might help improve the future cash flow of the organization.
Absolutely. The other thing is, I would just say in closing, and Leah, I'll turn it back over to you. Getting very comfortable with what are your non-negotiables. You will have a business at the end of this. We will have a community at the end of this. And there are certain things that, we're a company that runs like a family. What aspects of that family culture, what aspects of those family values are absolutely non-negotiable? If you identify those and live into those and remain true to those, I think you will be able to honestly say that you wrestled with both the forever and the today simultaneously, and still were able to maintain your integrity and live in your integrity through this process. If you don't, introspect in some of those ways and identify those non-negotiables, then you are in many ways, only reacting to the winds and the trends that you face day to day. What are your core values? What is the defining element of you, your leadership, and your organization that you are not willing to negotiate? And then everything else becomes open for interpretation and open to negotiation in a world that's fundamentally challenging how we think about deciding and making decisions and executing day to day. So with that, I would just like to say again in closing, thanks to the GDMP for what you do. Thanks to Leah for organizing this, and thanks for giving us the opportunity to chat with the folks assembled here. But it's going to be organizations like the GDMP that allow us to sustain and maintain through and beyond our time of COVID-19. Leah?
Thanks so much, Matthew and Wade. We, the Greater Des Moines Partnership, absolutely appreciate you making this information available and having this conversation, helping us to focus a little bit on the local and the global impact of COVID-19 on business, those short-term and immediate pivot points to, more agile institutions, if possible, in order to maintain business, and helping us too to think a little bit more specifically about the long term and how our organizations are going to need to rethink the daily activity. So very much appreciate you joining us today. I do want to let everybody know and remind you again that we will make the presentation recording available most likely at the end of this week. When we will also send that link and share that with the folks at Baton Global so they can promote that and share that directly with folks through their social channels as well. Before we complete the session, Matthew, is there anything else that you wanted to add?
I think I'm good. The only thing that I would say, we call this ambidexterity, organizational ambidexterity. Can you walk and chew gum at the same time? Can you, use your left hand and your right hand maybe? But organizational ambidexterity is about, can we compete, exist, and survive in the present while simultaneously maintaining a steadfast focus on the long term, and allow the steadfast focus on the long term dictate and inform our decisions in the short term. So if you can walk and chew gum at the same time, you can do this. Whether you're a small business, a large complex organization, or a multinational, growing into this organizational ambidexterity is not only going to be important for the COVID time, it's going to be important, beyond COVID-19. So, Leah, thanks for having us, and thanks for giving us all a little bit of hope as we rally around the local. Wade, anything else?
Just a reminder for everybody to be kind to themselves as we're all grappling with new things, and to look for those learning opportunities. This can really be a time to focus and leverage on some things that will improve the long-term sustainability of your enterprise.
Leah?
All right. Thank you both again. Thank you to Dr. Matthew Mitchell and Wade Brett, Baton Global. I'm going to go ahead and we'll pause here. If you'd like to leave your last slide up, Matthew. And thank you again, everybody who was able to participate today.
Thank you.